Hello, APUSH students. This is Chapter 26, The Great West and the Agricultural Revolution, 1865 to 1896. This is really the last chapter in Period 6 for AP US History, 1865 to 1898. So we've talked about industrialization, urbanization, political corruption. Now we need to bring in talking about the Great West and bring that in with some greater detail. So we're going to talk about Native American resistance against the reservation system on the frontier and the federal government's policies aimed at subjugating Native Americans, and then we're going to shift to the impact of mining and farming on the West, and then subsequent political movements that come out of the West, such as the Populist Party. So let's get started. The last time we really talked about Native Americans in this class was the Indian Removal Act under Andrew Jackson in the 1830s and the subsequent forced removal and relocations of Native Americans to Indian Territory in present-day Oklahoma. Remember, this only applied to Native American tribes living east of the Mississippi River. So what was going to happen to those Native American groups in Louisiana territories in the West wasn't really decided by the government until after the Civil War. Most settlers prior to the Civil War were going straight to Oregon or trying to find gold in California. So it's after the Civil War and the Homestead Act that more attention is given to the groups of Native Americans living in the Great Plains area. The federal government during this time tries to negotiate treaties with various tribes in order to purchase areas of land from the Native Americans. This was done without really a clear understanding of how Native American culture and society functioned. Many of the Great Plains Indian groups were nomadic, meaning that they roamed all over the place and really didn't have this fixed idea of being confined to a certain territory. And, other parts of this is that there were leaders of various groups, but there was no one great chief of the Sioux Indians, for example. Most of these groups were small family groups, so there really wasn't one person who could speak for the entire tribe or region. So, you're going to have agreements that are made with certain factions of the Sioux tribe, but there are other groups that are not going to abide by or agree to those terms. So not only that, but any of the treaties that were done were repeatedly broken by the federal government. So the federal government did not have a good track record of actually honoring the treaties that they made. So many of these treaties called for annuity payments to the Native American groups, as well as promises to supply them with food and clothing, but Indian agents were very corrupt and the needs were not met by the federal government. So, the trend I've talked about before is that, settlers would go and settle on Native American ancestral lands. That would lead to attacks on white settlers. Sometimes the Native American groups were starving and were killing livestock in order to survive. And then that would lead to reprisals by the federal government. So it's around this time that the federal government develops the reservation system, which was meant to confine Native American groups to a very specifically delineated plot of land. This is going to be met with a large amount of resistance from various Native American groups, and it's important to know a couple of these conflicts. Here's a map that shows various Native American conflicts between Native American groups and the federal government over the course of the 1860s and 70s. The first event I want to talk about is the Sand Creek Massacre, which occurred in present-day Colorado. So basically, gold had been discovered in parts of Colorado, so the federal government revised a treaty that reduced the Cheyenne Reservation down by 1/3. The Cheyenne Indians were split over whether or not to observe this treaty, so a band of Indians continued to hunt and live in areas that were technically outside of the reservation. So fights between settlers and Native Americans occurred, and reprisals happened over the course of the early 1860s. By 1864, one part of the rebel group of Cheyenne Indians camped by the Sand Creek in order to negotiate their surrender to the U.S. government. They flew a United States flag and a white peace flag underneath it, and it was there that the Colorado Cavalry, commanded by Colonel John Chivington, attacked the encampment. They ultimately killed about 130 Native Americans, out of which 105 were women and children. The U.S. soldiers then went back and removed the scalps from many of the dead Native Americans. This event was listed on a plaque that commemorated the Colorado Cavalry, which is in front of the Denver State House, as a battle that the cavalry participated in the course of the Civil War. Nowadays, we call it an atrocity, and it has since been revised by having another plaque placed next to the statue that says this event has been mischaracterized because it's collectively now understood that it was a massacre. So this is in the minds of Native Americans when the Battle of Little Bighorn happens in 1876. So this event stands out as one of the few victories for Native Americans who resisted the reservation system, but is going to be very, very short-lived. In the area of present-day South Dakota, Wyoming, and Montana, a band of Sioux Indians had rejected a treaty that confined them to a reservation in the Pine Ridge area of southwestern South Dakota. When gold was discovered in the reservation, settlers began moving in there and there were attacks against the settlers. Because of this, the federal government pursued these Native American groups. The U.S. troops were led by a general named George Custer, who near the Little Bighorn River divided his men into 3 groups to try to outflank the Native Americans. And it was on June 26, 1876, that Custer and his 250 men came upon 2,500 armed Sioux Indian warriors. Nearly all of the men in the 7th Cavalry who were there, including Custer himself, were killed in the battle. And I say that it was short-lived because the call for reprisals and vengeance against the Native Americans was very strong from the American public. The fact that, most, if not all, of the U.S. troops had been killed in this battle, there was a demand to do something about it. So Sitting Bull was one of the Sioux leaders who was forced to flee to Canada because he was being pursued by the federal government. And we're going to hear about him later because he was granted amnesty and participated in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show for a number of years before going back to live on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. Crazy Horse, another Sioux leader, surrendered to U.S. troops but was stabbed by a bayonet as he was being put into his prison cell, and he died the next day. After that, most of the remaining Sioux Indians were forced to relocate to the reservation, and as we're going to see, resistance against this reservation is going to effectively be curtailed. Another similar struggle took place with the Nez Perce Indians, who occupied the territory in present-day states of Washington, Oregon, and Idaho. Again, the Nez Perce Indians were divided over whether or not to accept a treaty which would move them onto a reservation. Rather than be moved to a reservation, one group of Nez Perce Indians, led by Chief Joseph, fled from the reservation. They were pursued by U.S. troops for over 1,100 miles, and they were trying to flee the government and forge alliances with other Native American groups. First, they tried with the Crow Indians in Montana and Wyoming, but when that didn't work out, they tried to make a break for Canada to meet up with Sitting Bull's band of Indians who had fled after Little Bighorn. They were caught by U.S. troops 40 miles from the border, and after the ensuing battle, the Nez Perce Indians surrendered to the federal government. These Native Americans were then sent to a reservation in Kansas, where approximately 40% of them died from diseases. One of the things that hastened the decline of Native American groups was the virtual extinction of the buffalo from the frontier. The U.S. Army pursued an aggressive policy to try to exterminate the buffalo from the frontier and supplied buffalo hunters with free ammunition in order to hunt and kill buffalo. The buffalo hunters were only interested in the hides and the tongues of the buffalo, and they left the rest of the buffalo to basically rot. In the 1600s, it's estimated there were roughly 25 to 30 million buffalo in the United States. By 1884, that number was somewhere close to 1,000. Without a food source like the buffalo, many Native American groups were forced to confine themselves to reservations. However, the federal government, again, routinely denied to give Native Americans their annuity promises of food and clothing. And this whole time I've been saying buffalo, but technically the word should be bison. I think this picture really shows it. This is a picture of buffalo skulls, and it was taken sometime around 1870. The buffalo bones could be used as decorative souvenirs, but one of the functions that buffalo skulls would serve would be grinding the bones down and forming them into glue. And so you're seeing this is a mountain of buffalo skulls as they're being prepared to be shipped to, manufacturing facilities. Two events that signify the end of effective Native American resistance in the United States are the massacre at Wounded Knee and the subsequent effects of the Dawes Severalty Act. Wounded Knee occurred near the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, which was the location of many of the Sioux Indians who had resisted the government in the Battle of Little Bighorn. Starting in 1880, a movement called the Ghost Dance became a widespread movement that spread to Sioux Indians in South Dakota. This was started in Colorado by a Native American leader who believed that practicing this ceremonial dance would cause the buffalo to reappear on the earth and white men would disappear. It became extremely popular with a lot of Native American groups, but federal agents who were watching the reservation felt this movement was challenging their authority and could spread to some resistance. So they took steps to curtail the spread of the ghost dance. One step they took was arresting Sitting Bull, who didn't necessarily approve of the ghost dance, but he allowed his followers to practice it. He had been allowed to return to the Pine Ridge Reservation after being granted amnesty from the government. And a scuffle broke out between one of Sitting Bull's followers and the Native American police who had been sent to apprehend him. And in the ensuing fight, Sitting Bull was shot and killed. When a number of Ghost Dance leaders heard about this, they fled the reservation because they feared there were reprisals from the government. They were then pursued by federal agents and surrounded near Wounded Knee Creek on December 29, 1890. In the subsequent attempts to disarm the Native Americans, a fight broke out, and approximately 200 Native American men, women, and children were killed by U.S. troops. Two Native American groups. This incident stands out as one of the most tragic massacres in their history. The Dawes Severalty Act, passed in 1887, further attempted to dismantle Native American cultural practices by breaking up reservations into small homestead plots and assigning families individual plots of land. Only Native Americans who accepted the system would be granted U.S. citizenship, and if the land wasn't claimed, the remainder was going to be sold off. So what you're going to see is a significant reduction of Native American tribal lands that then get sold off to railroads and other private interests. Also, at this time, a number of boarding schools were established for the education of Native American children. Many of these were far away from reservations, and the purpose of the schools was to assimilate Native Americans into American society. They were forbidden from speaking their native language or practicing cultural traditions. And this was done in an attempt to, quote, civilize Native Americans. The boarding schools, along with the forced adoptions of Native American to white families, went on up until the 1950s. The book mentions the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, so I will briefly talk about it here. You see in the Dawes Act this move from taking away tribal authority over Indian lands and individually parceling out land to individuals to try to civilize them. The Indian Reorganization Act was an attempt to reverse that and allowed some sort of tribal authority over reservation lands. But by then, the damage had kind of been done, as about 50% of 1880s era reservation land had been sold off by 1900. So just to illustrate that, the original borders of the Great Sioux Reservation as determined in 1868, and you can see the loss after battles and, homesteading and the Dawes Act. And the land that is available today is the land in dark red. Just to further illustrate it, the Lakota people, there's actually a Republic of Lakota that declared its independence in 2007, and this is the land they are claiming is owed to them by the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie, which the federal government broke the treaty and has refused to honor it. In this section, we're going to talk about the importance of mining and its effect on the development and settlement of the American West. You probably already know about the California Gold Rush in 1848 and the subsequent 48ers and 49ers who tried to get rich in California. A similar event is going to happen in 1858 with the discovery of gold in what is now Colorado. At the time, Colorado was part of the Kansas and Nebraska territories, and the discovery of gold near Pikes Peak is going to attract a slew of people that are dubbed 59ers or Pikes Peakers. Similar events are going to happen in Nevada with the discovery of the Comstock lode, which was a huge amount of silver, and it's going to cause people to move out there to try to get rich. Prior to the mining industry coming in and taking over, these are individuals that are trying to stake their claims and get rich on a personal level. However, with the rise of industrialization and corporations after the Civil War, these small miners are going to be supplanted by large-scale mining companies, and these individual miners are going to be relegated to becoming day laborers who don't get to keep their gold and instead have to work for a wage. So it's mining combined with the Homestead Act that more people move into these areas and settle. There's some significant impacts from these actions that I want to talk about briefly. For one thing, the discovery of precious metals like gold and silver helps finance the Civil War. And the relative amount of equality in the frontier leads to the right to vote being extended to women much earlier than in the East Coast. Access to these mining towns and the ability to transport these metals also contributed to an increase in railroads to these areas in the West. And by the end of the 1800s, Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, Montana, Idaho, and Washington are all added as states to the Union. Another issue that's going to come up is related to the monetary policy of the United States. As more silver and gold is discovered in the West, it's going to bring up a big debate in the country about whether to keep the monetary supply based on the gold standard or to allow for the coinage of silver at the U.S. Mint. I'm going to explain this later in the chapter. So again, showing the reduction of Native American tribal lands over the course of American history. One of the important effects of the Transcontinental Railroad is that it increased nationwide demand for products that previously you couldn't get unless you lived in that area. So one such product was cattle, and specifically beef. In order to move these Texas Longhorn cattle from where they were raised to shipping centers and stockyards in the cities, they would go on what was called the long drive, which is basically moving them up from Texas to the northern Great Plains. The people recruited to accomplish this were known as cowboys. Their job was to keep the cows safe and herd them along. And there's a couple of interesting things about cowboys that I want to mention to you. One is that the cowboy is one of the most enduring images of America, and there have been a lot of movies that are made about this topic. A lot of this is mythologized, and the real era of cowboys really only lasted from 1865 until about 1895. After that, the development of technology and industrial farming practices led to the long drive basically being eliminated. But for those 30 years, cowboys were very active and working this long drive. This is one of the few jobs in America that didn't discriminate on the basis of race. All the owners cared about was that you could ride a horse and do your job. So you're going to have African American and Mexican cowboys working alongside white cowboys doing this work. They would be on the saddle for about 12 hours a day, and a drive would take about 12 weeks. So the work was so demanding and the pay was so low that 75% of cowboys only did this one time before finding something else to do. When the job was over, they would basically receive their pay all at once, and then they would go and blow all their money in these cow towns. That's where you have the reputation of, saloons and people playing cards and gunfights and standoffs and bar fights and things like that. So contrary to another belief we have about the Wild West, there were very strict gun control ordinances in western towns because the locals didn't like cowboys coming in and messing up the place. There was a really bad winter in 1886 and 87, which killed thousands of head of cattle. And this event, in conjunction with overgrazing and overproduction, leads to a change in the way cattle were raised. Most of them are kept in ranches and simply fed and housed in the winter instead of being moved along this long drive. And we're also going to see basically the cowboy era end by the 1890s. But it's still one of the things that people most closely associate with America. Here's an example of some of the long drives and the different trails that these cowboys would take. The Homestead Act, if you remember, was passed during the Civil War and allowed for people to be given 160 acres of land in the West if they improved on it and lived on it for 5 years. This is a departure from previous land policies in the United States because previously they had sold land to earn money and gain revenue, but now they're basically just giving it away. Many of these homesteaders are going to struggle because the land they gained didn't get a lot of rain, or corporations would hire homesteaders to grab the best properties and they would barely improve it in order to retain it after 5 years. So over time, many of these individual homesteaders are going to have to adopt farming practices like dry farming, which is farming at the very top of the soil. This is going to help develop the land, but it's also going to deplete the soil very quickly. And looking ahead, we're going to see huge dust storms in the Great Plains areas in the 1920s and 30s, known as the Dust Bowl. But over time, irrigation projects and dams are built that bring more water to these dry western areas. You can see kind of the division between rainfall between the eastern part of the Great Plains and then that western part of the Great Plains. This shows a map of land owned by the federal government, and you can see the federal government has a lot more land out in the west. The settlement of the West is going to be incredibly rapid, and you're going to see 8 states added between 1876 and 1896 because of the influx of people in these areas. After the Mormons banned polygamy in 1890, Utah is set to become a state by 1896. By 1890, there is no discernible boundary for the frontier, and the American frontier is unofficially deemed to be closed. This is a rapid development because the Secretary of War said that settlement of the West would take approximately 500 years. So we're also going to see, the preservation of land become a priority of the federal government. And in 1872, Yellowstone Park is established as one of the first national parks with federal land. So we're going to see this become a trend, and conservation and preservation becomes an idea that starts to take shape in the late 1800s. Similar to corporate mining practices in the West and industrialization of factories, farming is going to go through rapid mechanization and industrialization, where many of these Western farms basically become giant outdoor factories for producing single cash crops such as wheat or corn. We talked about the mechanical reaper during the market revolution, but now you have mechanical combines, which is basically a combination of a reaper and a thresher, and it dramatically increases the speed of harvesting. You also had plows and seeders that are powered by steam engines. Farmers are going to manufacture crops for money and then are going to use that money to buy manufactured goods either in town or by mail order. So now we are seeing farmers become producers and consumers in this larger economy. This is going to present a challenge to small farmers in, which can't compete with the larger industrial enterprises. Looking ahead in the chapter, this is why the populist movement gains momentum. The life of a farmer was incredibly difficult in this time. Farmers had to pay their mortgages and took out large amounts of money to buy their homes and land, as well as to have the machinery necessary to have their production and make a profit. But they were subject to price fluctuations from the crops they produced. So they could have good years, but they could also have really disastrous years, and they would still have to make their mortgage payments on time. And if they didn't, they would lose their farm. Because of this new farm machinery, output is going to increase. And when you have more of something in the economy, the price is going to go down for that commodity. So farmers are feeling the pressure of this mechanization, and it's hurting a lot of small farmers. So by 1890, half of the U.S. population still worked in farming, but up to this point, it had been hard for them to get organized in any collective way. For one thing, farmers by nature are kind of spread out and individualistic, but they collectively had a lot of things in common. So they were subject to abuse by the banks, railroad companies, and local and state governments. The banks' interest rates they had to pay on their mortgages were really high, and there was nothing they could really do about it. So there's this collective anger directed at Wall Street and bankers who are making them pay these ridiculous interest rates on their land. They also had their land overassessed by state and local governments. They overassessed the value, which then caused them to pay really high property taxes. Monopolies on companies and more control over the companies such as the railroad, fertilizer companies, even barbed wire companies, meant they were forced to pay the price the company demanded. So this anguish and frustration is what constitutes the backdrop of the populist movement. Over the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, the unrest of farmers is going to form into political action. So there are a number of precursors to the populist movement that you don't really need to know, but I'm going to mention them here just briefly. In 1868, there was a group called the Greenback Movement that wanted to increase the production of paper money, which would cause inflation. So remember that farmers wanted the prices of their goods to go up, and that's basically what happens when you have inflation. And one way to trigger inflation is by printing more money and putting more money in circulation. So this movement, as well as the Greenback Labor Party, is going to become a political movement trying to bring this issue onto the national stage. Then you had groups called the Grange that were trying to establish cooperatively owned stores amongst the farmers to try to manufacture their own farming machinery and try to get around the abusive prices and control from corporations. The Farmers Alliance in Texas is similar in that they try to form cooperative buying and selling of their products in order to get better shipping prices with the railroad companies. The idea is that if all of them band together, they can stand up to these corporations. But as you can probably guess, the Farmers Alliance excluded black farmers, which in general made organizing farmers in the South and West a difficult thing because of racial animosities. So no labor organization in American history is going to ever really be able to successfully tackle that issue and get farmers and industrial workers to see that they're all facing similar forms of exploitation, and banding together might make them a very powerful political force. The biggest concerted push that we're going to see at the end of the 1800s is called the Populist or People's Party. They form into a major political party with a number of demands. So first, they want to nationalize the railroads, telephone, and telegraph, and have the government control them because they feel those industries are exploiting the farmers, and government control over them would make them more equitable. They also wanted a graduated income tax, which means that if you make more money, you pay a higher percentage of taxes. So we can see who that's directed at. And they wanted senators to be elected by the people instead of by the state legislatures. This would give everyday people more control over their government because they felt the government exploited them and didn't really listen to their interests, especially the federal government on the East Coast. Lastly, they wanted the unlimited coinage of silver. This one bears some explaining. So from America's founding up until 1873, America had been on a bimetallic system, meaning that gold and silver were the standards through which money was circulated and printed. And so the amount of money in circulation was based on the amount of gold and silver that the United States government had. In 1873, a law was passed that put America strictly on the gold standard, meaning that the money that was printed and was circulated was restricted to the amount of gold that they had in reserve, according to the value of the gold they had. So this lack of circulation of money was causing deflation. And as you remember, the farmers wanted inflation because they wanted the prices of their goods to be higher, which would hopefully then help them pay off their debts. Also remember from earlier in this chapter about the Comstock lode in Nevada and the amount of silver that had been discovered and mined in the West. Since 1873, that silver wasn't worth as much if you brought it to the bank, so people had kind of been hoarding their raw silver. If that silver could be coined the same way as gold, it would lead to inflation and help the farmers pay off their debts. Now, I know what you're saying. Why would anyone want higher prices? This is kind of a gamble because we look at inflation as pretty bad because prices go up and people can't afford them. But the idea the farmers had was the prices of their goods would go up. They could then pay off their debts, and then they could rein in inflation after that. So it was a way of addressing their financial hardships. And so the idea of a gold standard versus a silver standard or a gold and silver bimetallic standard is going to become the major issue of the late 1800s. And this is going to put the farmers against the Eastern businessmen and banks who have all the loans that the farmers are owing them to. They don't want inflation because they are in a good position of being, having the farmers owe them money. So the lines are kind of being drawn here between what are seen as the Eastern businessmen, industrialists, bankers, and elites versus the everyday hardworking farmers who are being exploited by the rich and powerful. If this sounds familiar to you, it does. This is a cartoon that kind of satirizes the People's Party and kind of is making fun of it, right? So as you can see, there's a number of prominent populist candidates on the balloon, and it's pieced together from all those different groups that I talked about. It's from even some people from the other chapters. So you have even people who were supported Prohibition. You had the old Knights of Labor people. The Knights of Labor was in serious decline. You had some socialists there. You have free silver people, the old Grangers, Greenbacks, and Farmers Alliances, and you have some communists put in there too. So obviously, this is meant to make fun of the People's Party as being just too many different interests, and it's called, the subtitle is The Platform of Lunacy. So, this isn't entirely wrong because what we're going to see is that there's a fracturing within the Populist Party because there are so many different interest groups coming together. They couldn't really all agree on one unifying platform. However, the issues that they address do get absorbed into the major political parties, and many of the reforms that they are seeking from the previous slide are going to be realized over the next 30 years. So the 16th Amendment establishes an income tax. So you do see a graduated income tax coming to America. 17th Amendment calls for the direct election of senators, and so you do have that happening as well. So we do see some of the things the populists were looking for become realized. However, the silver issue and nationalization of banks and railroads, we're not going to see that happening. So things were already bad for the farmers, and then along comes an economic panic in 1873 that is pretty severe. Again, my knowledge of economics isn't great, but let's just say that it was, again, too many banks loaning out too much money, and then some crop failures in Argentina led to the banks calling in their loans and hoarding their gold reserves. So banks aren't lending any money, which is causing the economy to slow down, and unemployment is going to grow in the United States. This event is going to give a lot of fuel to the populist movement, but it's also going to lead to another set of labor strikes and events that are going to form possible alliances with the populists. Coxey's Army was the name given to a group led by a businessman named Jacob Coxey, nicknamed the General, who made a march on Washington to try to get the government to relieve unemployment by spending money on public works programs, which would then cause some inflation and give people jobs. Looking ahead, this is kind of what the New Deal does to try to relieve the Depression in the 1930s. Coxey and some of his followers are arrested before entering Washington, and the movement collapses. But it's just important to know that this is a time period when people were looking to the government to intervene in the economy and address the issues related to unemployment of the working classes and workers' rights. Then in 1895, the Pullman strike happened. So in Illinois, workers at the Pullman Company made these things called Pullman sleeper cars, which were basically train cars that you could sleep in. And they were made by the Pullman Company, headed by George Pullman. Anyway, Pullman had his workers live in his factory town, and so they paid rent to the Pullman company. And he paid the workers actually pretty well, but the rent was also really high, and that was a way to try to keep them in their jobs. But then, because of the Panic of 1893, Pullman reduced wages by 1/3 in his factories, but he did not change the cost of the rent that these workers were forced to pay. So the workers couldn't afford to live there, and they couldn't really afford to leave or do anything else. So this is what triggers the Pullman strike. This strike was led by Eugene Debs of the American Railway Union. And I just want you to remember the name Eugene Debs because he's going to come up later in American history. He's going to become a prominent socialist in American history. The strike was eventually broken when the strikers tried to stop railway cars from moving, but the train company attached postal cars from the U.S. Postal Service to them, so technically they were interfering with the delivery of mail, which is a federal offense. So then federal troops, the federal government, issued an injunction to stop the strike, and the strikers resisted, and federal troops were dispatched to break up the strike and imprison the strikers. Eugene Debs is going to serve some time in prison for failing to abide by the federal injunction to stop the strike. So anyway, all these issues related to the economic panic, the grievances of the populace, and labor struggles all come into play in the election of 1896. So the election of 1896, we see the challenge between the Republicans and the Democrats. The Republicans have William McKinley, a Civil War veteran from Ohio, which we know is a swing state, and William Jennings Bryan, who is a politician from Nebraska. He was kind of unknown up until this point, but he's going to rise to national prominence in large part because at the Democratic Convention, in which the Democrats get together and decide who they're going to nominate for president, William Jennings Bryan delivers a speech called the Cross of Gold, which he talks about the gold standard versus the silver standard and how the gold standard was benefiting the upper classes and elites from the East Coast. And one of the famous lines is that you shall not crucify mankind on a cross of gold, saying that, adopting the gold standard is killing the people, essentially. So this electrifies the Democrats and the populists as well. And the populists throw their support behind Bryan for the election of 1896. And the Democrats adopt a platform that included the coinage of silver and lowering tariffs. As we're going to see, McKinley's going to win the election. But this is going to lead to what people call the fourth party system. Even though the Republicans and Democrats are still the two dominant political parties in the United States, we are going to see a shift in the issues they are addressing. Between the end of the Civil War and this time, the issues that we saw were largely civil service reform and monetary standards. Now, the issue is going to be whether or not the federal government should regulate the industrial economy and should intervene more in addressing some of these problems. And it's largely because of the influence of the populists that this is an issue the government is starting to address. So again, looking at the division between kind of rural America and urban America, if you want to call it that, these are the votes, the popular vote, how it broke down for William Jennings Bryan in blue and William McKinley in red. So McKinley wins 271 to 176 in the Electoral College. The popular vote was a little bit closer. McKinley got 7.1 million votes, and Bryan got 6.4 million. So, fairly close in the popular vote. But you can see that the Northeast, the industrial areas of the country, go towards McKinley, also where there are more people, and then Southern farmers and Western farmers are going to be supporting the Democrats. That's it. Thank you for listening.